Let's see if this works, guys, because never let roadblocks stop you from moving forward. So thanks for everyone that's tuned in already. I'm glad you can hear. There's Mark.
Hey, sideways.
Oh, should I have to go sideways?
Wait.
I don't know.
How did that happen?
I don't know. Odd.
Wait.
Whoa.
Not that way.
Oh, this is great.
Wait. So how do I get right side?
You're right side up for me. I don't know if maybe your screen.
But just sideways when I do this.
I don't know.
It's okay. Once you guys can see me.
And see me and hear us.
Does that work? This is totally sideways. So if I look like I'm not looking at you, that's because.
Yeah, I don't know. It looks great and it's working. Thank you guys for tuning in. We are, oh, you straight now. We are 18 minutes into the 4 o'clock hour, and we apologize sincerely. Zoom seems to have been acting up. Nonetheless, thank you guys for joining us for our first installment of Siren Sundays. I know a lot of people were kind of like, what is Siren Sundays? You know, sounding the alarm, but, you know, sirens are mermaids, as am I. And just as sirens like to sing and bring people upon the rocks to crash, I think I should use my powers for good and educate people about the rocks that we all live on, you know? So today, of course, we're talking about lunarscaping, and I have Mark, who is one of the coolest people I've met in my conservation career thus far. So if you want to, if you want to take some time to just introduce yourself and let us know about you.
Who I am and why I'm sitting here.
Yes.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Daniels. By training, I am a botanist. I did my postgraduate degree in botany at Miami University. But apart from that, I've had a wealth of experience working at the Bahamas National Trust along with Lashanti and a number of my colleagues on this video. And as you know, in protecting national parks and protected areas, you go in all types of environments. You move through nature pretty readily. You get involved in research. So there's a wealth of experience there with regards just to being out in nature. And before that, or I guess during that process, I also had some experience doing hydroponics farming, organic farming. I had a group of us called Homegrown that did backyard farming classes and landscaping. And so anything related to plants, I'm typically excited about. So I think Lashanti and I, we had a chat just about, you know, some of the things that aren't always in your scientific journals and some of the more esoteric, quote unquote, things or traditional or cultural practices. And then that's where the idea for this talk came up, because I like that as well. I understand the importance of traditional folklore, culture, myths, mythologies, all these things. They all have a role to play in our understanding of this world we live in. So I am excited to be here and chat about this.
Definitely, and I'm excited to have you. So like I said earlier, we're talking about lunarscaping, or some people can term it celestial planting, which is all about why do people decide to go with the phases of the moon to plant these things. And I know that you would have been the most ideal person to talk about this. So can you just tell us maybe about some of the traditional planting that we as Bahamians have done over the years in regards to following the moon cycles, and why?
Well, I'm gonna step it back further and let's talk about where this practice maybe came from. Now, you know, we all did. First of all, we might have all watched Sesame Street at some point, and there's a character on there called Super Grover, and Super Grover's best power, or his only power, is the power of observation. And the power of observation is really what has led to much of our agricultural and farming practice, not only here in the Bahamas, but across the planet. You know, you go in biology or agricultural class in high school and they teach you about the ancient Egyptians and how their contributions to agriculture still influences our practices today. And a lot of that has to do with their cultural practice of observing nature and the elements and the natural processes and cycles that exist. And this doesn't come from observing nature for a season or two. This is centuries of observation. That's a cultural practice. And so specifically for the Nile, much of their uh, observation would have been around the operations of the Nile River and how that river would flood and inundate the banks, bringing rich mineral deposits to the land as a part of their annual cycle for farming and planting. And so survival was intimately connected to nature and those natural processes that exist in the world around us. And that civilization took the time and energy to observe that, document it, and pass it along from generation to generation, and weave that entire principle of observing nature not only into farming, but every fabric of their culture and society. So we can talk about that at some other time. But for farming, yes, observing the cycles of nature. And so if we are talking about the moon, we know the moon is kind of what, a 29 and a half day cycle, lunar cycle. And one of the things that has been observed over time that we know here in the Bahamas is that the tides tend to follow the moon. And so we see that during a new moon or a full moon, the tides tend to be higher than when there is, during in between phases. And similar to how the tides will rise on the sea, our local farmers would have noticed that the water in the ground, it also has a pull effect from the moon. And so groundwater would also be affected by the phase of the moon and its position relative to the earth. The moon is closer to the earth, and so its gravitational pull is stronger than that of the sun. So it has more influence on the tide than the sun. So for example, if you're going to sow seeds, right, let's say you didn't have any water, right? You didn't have a bucket of water, maybe you have a blue hole that's nearby. But if you wanted to have the best chance for your seeds to germinate, we know that for germination, you need moisture, the right temperature, um, darkness, and one or two other factors probably in the soil. That moisture component at the new moon and the full moon, when the moon is said to pull that water through the soil close to the surface, it would guarantee your seeds stay saturated over a consistent period and increase your germination rate. To take that a step further, once your plants are actually growing, this, this dynamic influence is also observed in the internal water storage within the plant itself. So for example, if you have a tomato plant, and if you were to, I guess, observe the movement or the concentration of water moving through the plant during the full moon or approaching the full moon or the new moon, it would be said that the moisture accumulates in the upper portions of the plants. So that's in the branches, in the stems, in the leaves, and in the fruit. And if you were a traditional farmer following those practices, you would also say that this is the best time to harvest once your fruit is ripe, because all of that good energy and all of that moisture is now resting in the fruit of the plant or in the leaves of the plant that you're harvesting. Similarly, when there is less impact of groundwater by the moon, it's said that the water will fall into the ground. And so, for example, during so waxing would be when the moon is approaching full, and waning would be after it is past full. So during the waxing period, you would plant leafy crops or plants that would have, let's say, annuals that has fruit that you wanna reap: eggplant, tomatoes, cucumbers, those things. During the waning part of the cycle, as this groundwater is falling into the ground, it's also said that if you plant your root crops during the waning portion, that will increase the chance of success. And also, if you have these plants established in your farm and on your garden, that during let's say the inter periods where it's neither the full moon or the new moon, let's say the quarter moons, then where groundwater or let's call it the vibes have now left the above ground portions of your plant and have now accumulated in the roots. So your root crops are better harvested during the waning period of the moon cycle. So your potatoes and your carrots and beets and those things, your peanuts and things like that. So generally, that's in a nutshell what some people how some people may practice farming with relation to the moon cycle. And there's other celestial bodies out there that certain groups of farmers would pay attention to during their planting phase or during the farming season to give them clues or indications as to what to do with their crop or with their, let's say, their soil or their water. And that's a whole other philosophy of farming that we'll get to that too, but we were talking about the moon. So let's stop there. I'm just going to keep rambling.
Right, very interesting. And I think you said something that I know, and one of these things that I'm trying to do with this show is like breaking out of this silo where I feel like we're in this environmental community. We know the things that we're talking about, but oftentimes when we try to take that out of the environmental sector, when you say things like the moon controls the tide, right? People don't really automatically understand that or know what that means because it's never been something, I guess, relevant to their field of study. You know, I didn't even plug in me being a marine biologist. It's always important for us to monitor the tides because we need to jump in the water. And you being a botanist, you know, the groundwater concept. So I think just noting for people that the gravitational pull of our round Earth, so sorry, flat earthers, our round Earth is what, is what dictates those tides. And we do have those freshwater lens here in the Bahamas in our, I think it's focused in our pine forest, correct? Where you see most of those freshwater lens. Right.
Yeah, and you can also find them in those dunes, those like Holocene, Pleistocene dunes that are relatively close to the shoreline. So you can find water and sand as well.
Right. So, all right. So, which means, like you were saying, when the tides are high and the moon is pulling, that's closer to the surface. So, I just wanted to bring that note in, just for anyone who's watching and has no idea about tides, just in case. But anyway.
Yeah, that other method that it's called oh, it just slipped my mind. Biodynamic farming.
Okay.
So so that's where people are actually looking at the constellations and they say, oh, well, Cancer has this influence on this particular element. And when they're building their soils and making compost and compost teas and other organic fertilizers for their farm, they are paying attention to other celestial bodies. And it's a whole science behind it. Some call it a pseudoscience, but I guess only the practitioners could really vouch for it. But you should check it out. It's a biodynamic farming. Right. It's interesting.
It does sound interesting. And do you think, is this something that you've tried before, like any sort of backyard farming where you are now following the moon or any celestial body? And you've like kind of proven this theory?
Not the biodynamic farming. That requires that you're paying a lot of attention to certain stars and constellations, and the almanac helps. And there's a school of study behind it. I think it was founded by a German agriculturalist. I'm not sure how long ago, but there is a school of thought and study behind it. I've never went that extreme, but only those who've really tried it can validate. Right. Apart from that, it's your basic, you know the times of the year. Summer's approaching. All right, it's hurricane season. That the winds are shifting, and so during the hotter summer months, the wind tends to come from the east. In the colder months, the wind is coming from the west and northwest. And I think every farmer, no matter if you're an old school farmer who's been doing it for 60 years somewhere in Can Island, or you're the new backyard farmer that has a little grow box with some stuff in your yard, that you automatically pay attention to the weather and the climate, whether or not you admit it. So you want it to rain. You don't want it to rain excessively and drown your plants, but you pay attention to the days where you feel like, okay, it's going to rain today. Or if it's an overcast day, then okay, I can water my plants maybe a bit later. But if it's a clear day and the sun is blazing, you're not going to water your plants after a certain time because you risk burning your plants. That residual water on the leaves will burn your plant. And so you need to water early in the morning. So we're in the summertime now, and where are we? June. What's today's date? June 28th. So we're approaching July. So people who would have planted now, they're probably harvesting peppers. Strawberries are still growing now. Those warm summer crops, those okra, bean, corn, all of the squashes, so your pumpkins and cucumbers, uh, your butternut squashes and those things, pole beans, those things are all growing nicely now. Um, you're going to get to the part of the summer where it's going to be too hot. Well, we're already at the point where it's too hot to grow certain things. So usually your leafy greens are the first ones to go once it gets too hot. And your leafy greens, yes, your lettuce, kale, and things like that. All your lovely different greens that you love to put in your smoothies. Right now in the summertime, it's hard for them to grow under full sun without any sort of assistance from its farmer. So you see that the leafy greens would right now, if you want to grow leafy greens, either you're growing it in a hoop house, a greenhouse, or indoors hydroponically in some controlled environment. And, you know, we have the traditional way of farming, but technology isn't a bad thing. And there's certain things now that helps you to extend your growing season. So the old almanac that would tell you don't plant lettuce or leafy greens in June. That's if you're planting out in the field. If you have an indoor setup, a hydroponic setup, you have a really nice ventilated and climate controlled greenhouse, or you've put some effort into the placement of your bed into the cooler portion of your yard, and you have a hoop house, all those things will give you extend your growing season to varying lengths, depending on the technique you're using. So traditional methods are always good. However, now we're in a not one, especially with the uncertainty and the dependence, uncertainty with regards to, let's say, being locked down under this COVID-19 environment, the uncertainty of food security and whether or not food will be coming uh, on the ships and so forth and so on. But also with regards to the climate, we can't forget that climate change is still, we're in the midst of it. And although it's not a doom and gloom scenario from my standpoint, it's just like Super Grover says, you have to use your power of observation so that we survive, to learn to adapt. So, maybe before when it was, you were able to grow your crops in a wetland area that was saturated with fresh water and maybe on the edge of a marshland, that as time goes on, let's say either A, you have seawater inundation from a storm, or you have the groundwater being influenced by the saltwater layer due to sea level rise. Those areas that were wet and traditionally freshwater base may not be as fresh in the future. It may become more hypersaline. And so some of those ponds that would have been freshwater ponds are going to start to increase in salinity. And and you can observe those changes by watching the plant life around the edges and observing what's growing in there. And you don't have to be a biologist or a life scientist. Once again, you just use your powers of observation, and you also contact other farmers and learn, because things are changing. And so either you have to adapt to survive. Um, and so either you change the way you grow, where you grow, the technology you're using, or it's going to become more and more difficult for you to stick in your traditional methods. Now, not to say traditional methods will fail. Traditional methods, once again, are the foundation. So yes, you still watch your moon. You're watching, when rough weather is coming because you see the shorebirds coming from a particular direction, or you can tell that your ground is maybe high in limestone or too alkaline because there's a certain type of plant that's dominating that landscape. If you go, if you go into a recently dug up to like a quarry pit, those weeds that love to grow in that really alkaline, sterile soil, those give you an indication to what your soil is actually doing. Um, Traditional farmers may not have tested their soil as much, but in this day and time, I wouldn't say as much, there would have been other means for them to verify what's in their soil besides saying, I'm going to send it off to a lab and get my full readout. They would know how they've been amending their soils and would have done things to make sure that all those micronutrients are there. So whether it was burning the conch shell and crushing that and adding that there, or they were using the Epsom salts, they're using particular leaves from certain plants to add to their soil. There's always a knowledge behind it, using crab shells and crushing that in your compost so that you're adding calcium. There's still things that the traditional farming methods teach us. We just have to be aware that things are changing. So keep your eyes open and be willing to adapt and try something new.
Definitely. And we got a question, or yeah, a question from Lindy. Hi, Lindy, also a former coworker.
Hey, Lindy.
He was saying, how does climate change impact the creation of almanacs? And I know you mentioned that there were almanacs created by these farmers over the years, but as we see, the weather is changing. We never had a definite like winter and fall. It was always like summer here, and then occasionally a cooler time of year. But how does climate change come into all of this when we have our farming methods and these almanacs?
Yes. Yeah, so these almanacs, once again, that's based off of years of farmers and their observations, their agricultural practices that they would have done themselves or learned from other farmers, other cultures. That this massive knowledge that's accumulated over the years. Now we're in an unprecedented time, some would say, and so the unpredictability or the uncertainty is you're not as certain anymore that at the start of that the rains won't come until April, or that the beginning of summer is June 21st. From back in June, from June 1st, it was hot, and some people would say from May 1st that hurricane season should start because it was humid and there was lots of rain and the oceans were hot and things like that. So it requires one to have a knowledge of what's out there. So the almanacs are still valid. However, you must always be ready for the uncertainty. And so I would say some of those practices that may not be necessarily, let's say, unique to the almanac, but just what farmers should be thinking about in general is how to increase the resiliency of your farm. So think of the major inputs for your farm and how you can control or increase resiliency in that. So one, water, right? So if we're getting to periods of time where the rain periods aren't as certain, then we need to get into storage of water or finding ways to harvest water that can benefit your farm. And so, yes, instead of having those three large washouts in June, maybe that's now spread out that you're having one washout a month, or now you're having 6 a month. And so if you're responding to droughts, then you need to think about water storage. If you are responding to excessive rain, then when you're designing your farm, then you need to think of some of the things you can include in your farm design that can help you with some of these issues. So to prevent flooding, make sure your fields are elevated, or make sure there's good drainage. When you're planting in a hole, make sure you have some gravel down at the bottom to facilitate that drainage into the surrounding soil. And there's other techniques that you could incorporate into your farm to account for excessive rain. You can build ponds so you can have essentially rainwater ponds that can. Let me stick a pin right here. So where this is kind of going is into a conversation of permaculture. Yeah. So permaculture is this idea that you've designed your grow operation or your farm in a way that over time you are increasing your output while decreasing your inputs. So for a traditional row farmer, every year, okay, I have to add X amount of